Hola, bienvenidos a mi canal. I love to have you here. My name is Stefani. I am a language enthusiast and a polyglot that currently speaks 8 languages, and I love to share what I know about language learning, what I've figured out along the way. And in this video, I'll be talking about my experience with Spanish, how I've managed to learn it, what I recommend for learning Spanish, what resources, how to go about it, what some tricky points of the language are, and what you can do about that. And just overall try to cover as much of an intro of Spanish as possible so that you know how to approach this language if you're interested in learning it. So Spanish is an Indo-European language, and in particular it is a Romance language, which means that much like other Romance languages, say French, Catalan, Italian, Portuguese, Galician, Romanian, etc., it evolved from Vulgar Latin dialects. So all of those languages do share this in common. But why learn Spanish in particular? Well, every language deserves to be learned, of course. If you have any sort of particular passion for a specific language, etc., obviously it really helps with learning. In the case of Spanish, if you're interested to know beyond the personal, right, beyond you have Spanish-speaking friends or family, or you're just interested in culture, you're interested in the music, in the people, whatever it is, if you're interested to know beyond that about Spanish and what benefits it can bring, I would love to cover that. So Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. It is second in terms of number of native speakers, coming right after Chinese, and it has almost 500 million native speakers. And then on top of that, it has 500 million plus, close to 6, in terms of the total number of speakers, as in both native and people who have learned it. And it comes in at 4th place worldwide. So it is a very widely spoken language. It is not only spoken in Spain, but also in so many countries of Latin America and Central America, and a lot of the former Spanish colonies throughout the world, actually beyond the Americas. But speaking of the Americas, it is also quite popular in the United States, as there are many Hispanic communities there. It is spoken all over the world, and not just in countries where it is an official language, but also in others where there's going to be large communities of Hispanic immigrants, or for example, a lot of people that are studying this language at school, because it is quite popular to study as a second or third language, and it is a very important language internationally, being one of the official languages of the EU, the UN, and many international bodies. So it is quite the language in terms of the punch it packs, and in terms of native speakers, in terms of its importance on the international stage. Obviously, if you have friends or family in Spanish-speaking countries, or if you're interested in doing business with Spanish-speaking countries, it can be very useful to learn Spanish, because such a big chunk of the world speaks Spanish that you can easily justify learning it for that reason. But then there's also Hispanic culture, which is fascinating in my opinion. Spanish was, you're gonna find out later when I talk about how I got into it, but Spanish is my first great linguistic love, and I was in love with the culture of Spain, with the culture of Latin American countries, and I think that many people are, in terms of, most of us love, for example, music in Spanish, or food from the different countries where the language is spoken. And I think that there's something about the attitude of the people. I don't have much experience with countries in Latin America besides a little bit of travel, but I have lived in Spain, and there's this vibe of a slow life and just enjoying life, and that you get with having some conversations over some fabulous food at 11 p.m. in the evening, those famous late Spanish dinners, and there's this chill vibe that is wonderful. And I think that part of the culture, which is also present in other Romance countries, by the way, such as Italy, but I feel a lot of the attraction of the Spanish is that kind of slow life, that sometimes it's great to remember that and to immerse yourself in that type of culture. And so I think a lot of people also learn it from that type of cultural point of view, from enjoying this type of vibe that Spanish brings, or also you can learn it, for reasons such as the music or movies or anything like that you enjoy in Spanish. that has certainly been the case for me. For some languages I just learned for the music. So I think that is also another aspect that is attracting many people to Spanish, besides the business, besides the numbers. Another big thing with Spanish is that it is not too difficult for many speakers of different Indo-European languages, but in particular for English speakers, because I'm doing this video in English. So if you're a native English speaker, or if you speak English to a very high level, it's not going to be too difficult for you. The FSI, or the Foreign Service Institute of the US, they rank Spanish as one of the easiest languages to learn for English speakers, and that is because there's many words in English that actually have their origins in Latin. So it's a little bit easy that way to recognize a lot of the vocabulary. It's not gonna be as strange or as unknown as the vocabulary of Greek or Hungarian, for example, or languages like that. So with Spanish, you do get that bonus of, like, you know, just objective ease. A lot of the times, of course, it's going to be dependent on subjective factors as well, whether you find the language difficult or not. It's going to depend a lot on your passion. But in general, Spanish is one of the easier languages from an objective point of view, in particular for English speakers. Not to mention, if you speak another Romance language, then it's going to be a breeze. But if you don't, Spanish can be a great language to ease you into the Romance language world, because once you speak Spanish, it becomes easier to pick up Portuguese, French, Italian, etc. I have certainly done so, and I have to tell you, it is great to have that base of Spanish before you move into other languages. Obviously, you can use any to get into the Romance language family, but I think that with Spanish being so big, so popular, and if you have some reasons to learn it beyond that, if you have also some passion for it, it can be quite easy, and then it can also ease you into the whole Romance language world. So how did I learn Spanish? For me, it started when I was, I believe, 16 or almost 17, something like that. I really wanted to learn it, but there were no classes in my school. So at school, I learned English and German, and I just didn't really have the opportunity to learn Spanish, and I really wanted to, so I decided to go for it myself. And it was thanks to Spanish, thanks to my passion for that language, and thanks to that decision that I'm a polyglot today, because that's when I actually realized, oh, I can do this. I can learn languages by myself. I don't need classes. I don't need for that language to be available at school or anything like that. So what I did was, the first ever Spanish that I took was, I did this BBC Languages, like, it was called Mi Vida Loca. It was like an interactive sort of mini course of Spanish immersion. It was basically like a lot of conversations and scenarios, and you kind of had to pause the video and respond and stuff like that. Unfortunately, I don't think that is available anymore because it runs on Flash. So I just tried the website, and it's like my browser is not handling it. I think like Flash is not supported in most browsers nowadays. So it is not something that is very easy to find anymore, but I think you don't need to start with that course for sure. I'm gonna go over later on like what you can start with and how you can do this, but I did start with that course. And then I also picked up after that like another book. It was like an intro book to learn Spanish, which is actually not available right now, I think, online. I looked for it, but it's just like out of print or something, and it was in Bulgarian. So I have found something, actually, some books that are very, very similar in terms of what that book had, and I'm gonna list that in the description below so you can have some resources and some intro books. But I did that. I also listened to a lot of music. I love Latin American music, so that was a big thing for me. It was not a problem to go over. It was not like something that I didn't really like and music that I was not really into. No, I was already in love with the music, so it was very easy to use it to learn Spanish. A lot of like watching things, like for example, TV shows, videos on YouTube, stuff like that. I also had some speaking practice because I actually spent around 3 years of my life throughout different periods of time in the US. So there's a lot of Spanish speakers there, and I actually got to practice with them. And that's actually how I picked up quite a bit of the language. All in all, I was using quite a mix of different input methods, and then I was doing also some practice with speaking, and I was able to learn Spanish that way. And then later, when I actually worked for a year in Spain, that's when my Spanish really kind of started to become at this level where I could also use it for work and like business Spanish and that kind of stuff, and where I was able to actually solidify it. So how can you learn Spanish? What do I recommend in terms of steps for everybody to start? So that might, that first course that I was talking about, that might not be available anymore. But I think that there's a lot on YouTube that you can use as well. There's many great channels that have these little courses of Spanish. Like Laura at Couch Polyglot or Easy Spanish is also great. There's really a variety that you can find on YouTube, that there's this ability to learn through those videos. Then there's also some intro books. I'm a fan of intro books. I like them because they're structured. You don't have to go over everything. You can skip some parts if you really don't like some drills or something. But in general, just to have like some intro book to go over the language to ease you into it, I think it's a great idea. I have found some on Amazon that I think are great, and I'm gonna link them below in the description in case you want to check it out. And they're very similar to the intro books that I have used here in Bulgaria. Now, also, besides that, I think it can be great to read in the foreign language, and there's when you're really a beginner, you need some beginner short stories and things like that. There's many great ones, such as the ones by Orly Richards or The Little Prince in Spanish, all linked below in the description again. So I think like a lot of these are quite simple for beginners, and it's very good if you start to read those. In particular, The Little Prince, it exists in many languages, and I think it's a great book, even though it's a children's book technically, which I usually don't recommend because I think they're not interesting for most adults. But this one is simple, and it's also like a lot of adults appreciate it. So I think it's a good book. Also, like I mentioned, all these readers and like a lot of those like beginner readers in Spanish can be useful. And then later down the road, when you're better in Spanish, you can also read whatever book you're interested in. If you want to read like a specific author, be it fiction or non-fiction. Obviously non-fiction is easier to start with. Fiction is like I think when you're really advanced, because it has a lot of flowery language and that kind of stuff. But obviously later down the road you can progress with whatever your interests are, and you can read books on whatever topics that really, really interest you. But in the beginning, I suggest getting started with these like Spanish readers and things like that to get as much exposure as possible. So beyond your intro book, your Spanish readers, your YouTube channels that are great for learning Spanish, I suggest going into music as well, because the Spanish speaking world has amazing music. Some of the best music out there, in my opinion, comes from those countries. So a lot of the Spanish artists are quite famous all over the world. There's many that I like, there's many that I listen to. And I think that a lot of people like it. So if you're one of those people that like this type of music, it is a great way to boost your Spanish skills. You can sing along, have the lyrics in front of you and just kind of sing along and all of that. And it can be really helpful because music it taps into our emotions, it taps into our passion. And also music is something that we remember very well. There are songs that I remember from my childhood that I haven't listened to in, I don't know, like 15, 20 years, whatever. I still remember those songs. So I think that music sticks in your brain like nothing else does, and I would recommend it for sure. Thankfully, with Spanish, it's also easy to find resources in terms of beyond YouTube videos, for example, like movies and TV shows. That's not always easy with all languages, because for some languages, on the most popular streaming platforms and things like that, usually they're not available. And for some languages, it can be very hard to find movies, shows in the local language if you're not from that country and don't have access to that country's TV and streaming services and stuff like that. But with Spanish, thankfully, it's a language that's studied so much on all over the world, and there's and also has so many speakers all over the world. So access to programming in Spanish is super easy. There's many great films and TV shows that come from Spanish-speaking countries. So for finding movies and TV shows in Spanish, I recommend Language Reactor. I think it is great. Just Google it. It's like an extension for Chrome. Could be also for other browsers. It is amazing from the point of view that it works very well with Netflix, and you can have subtitles in 2 languages, whatever you pick. Whatever languages you pick, and it's great from that point of view. You can then export the transcript. You can click on a word and it gives you a meaning. It has like a lot of great options, but it also has this Netflix catalog and also YouTube catalog that is going to help you find content in the language you're learning. So for Spanish, there is a lot. And I think when it comes to TV shows, movies, stuff like that, I think everybody has like a different taste. So it'll be difficult for me to give some recommendations because I know that like everybody's into different genres, everybody likes different things to watch, both on YouTube and on Netflix and other platforms. But I feel like I have to give this recommendation in terms of like one show that I think is very good and that a lot of people can enjoy, and that is La Casa de Papel. It is great. Check it out. I would certainly advise you to watch this show. And then, of course, there's many other good ones. Let me know if you'd like me to like create a little bit of more of a resource list for other shows that I think are fun. But then again, just look in the Language Reactor catalog, because there you can see what genre it is. Is it gonna be good for you or not? Then you can filter by language and you can see what is available in Spanish, what movies, what TV shows, and what is to your taste, because there's, thankfully, like I said, there's a lot of choice in Spanish. Something that can also be great help to learn Spanish is cooking. I think if you like to cook, it is quite the opportunity. You know, with recipes in another language and like doing things like that, it can feel like you're not learning the language, but you are. And I'm saying that here because I believe that many countries in the Hispanic world have great cuisines. So for those of you that like to cook, I think it's Spanish is a good language, because then you can just watch recipes in Spanish. You can pick up a lot of words subconsciously that way, and it's a great thing to do, especially when it comes to culinary traditions in the Spanish-speaking world, which are amazing. Another great option are podcasts, and I think it's podcasts are something that can be amazing for language learning, because listening is very easy to do. As in, there's many opportunities to listen when you're otherwise occupied. You could be walking your dog, you could be commuting, you could be cleaning around your house. There's just a lot of opportunities to, even if you don't really have that much time to sit down and learn a language, to actually plug in your headphones and actually learn a language while you're doing another activity. So I always recommend listening, whether it is an audiobook or whether you want to do podcasts or music. It's amazing. So for podcasts, I think that it's very easy to find them in the language that you're interested in, if you're a little bit open-minded about like where to look for it and stuff like that. So it took me quite a while to figure it out how to do it, because whenever I would go on Apple Podcasts, for example, which is where I like to listen to my podcasts, I would just get this thing where I'm like, okay, but they're all like suggesting things to me in English or in Bulgarian, like what do I do? And it's sometimes hard to find them in a specific language because you don't know the name of the podcast to type. So like, how do you find it? You know, if you just want to browse a list of podcasts in a particular language, and then you want to see what's available, and then you want to pick it based on a topic you like, how do you do that? I actually used Castbox to do that. And as I said, I listen on Apple Podcasts, but on Castbox, it's very easy to change the country. And then you just look for podcasts based on that country or on that language. So I would recommend that if you also have this struggle of finding podcasts on topics that you like, whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. I think that Castbox is amazing in terms of searching. So you can very easily search by language on that app. And so I use it for that. I use it for like looking at podcasts and being like, oh, okay, I like this topic, I like this language. There we go. And then you can find that podcast, stay on Castbox, or if you prefer another provider, just go there. You can also get the news in Spanish, because there are many local newspapers, obviously, for like whatever language you want to learn. There's like no exception there. You're going to be able to find local newspapers on the internet. But beyond that, beyond the local newspapers, which I have some that I'm suggesting in the description again, but beyond that, if there's like a paper that you really like to read, if there's like a place where you really like to get your news, for example, I don't know, BBC, the New York Times, whatever, they have actually versions in Spanish. And that is the advantage of it being such a big language spoken by so many people. If you don't want to do local newspapers, and if you really want to do the newspaper that you already love, there's a very high chance that newspaper, website, whatever, is going to be available in Spanish. So check it out. It's a great way to stay with your favorite brand, but then also get it in Spanish. And last but not least, practice a lot of Spanish. With Spanish, again, much easier than with some languages with fewer speakers, because Spanish speakers are everywhere. It's very easy to meet people that are native speakers of that language. Not saying that you absolutely need to speak with native speakers. You don't. You can practice out loud, like speaking just yourself, whatever you decide to do. Just like try to speak in another language, practice in front of the mirror, whatever you want to do. If you're very introverted and you want to do that, that works. If you want to write, which is a little bit kind of like slower, low stakes speaking, you can also do that. But if you're extroverted and you want to practice with native speakers, that's the great thing about Spanish, that native speakers there's many in many countries of the world. There's populations of Spanish speakers, and it's also one of the most popular languages on the internet. So there's also a lot of opportunity to communicate online when it comes to Spanish. And so it's great. It's great that it's such a popular language. It's very easy to find people to practice with. And I would definitely recommend to take advantage of that, because in the case of Spanish, that helps a lot. What are some of the features of the Spanish language and the idiosyncrasies, and like what should we have in mind? One of the great things about Spanish is that you don't need to learn a new writing system if you're an English speaker, or if you are already used to the Latin alphabet, as I believe most people are. So you actually don't really need to worry too much about it, because there's of course the letter ñ, which has like a tilde on top of the n, and then there's also like on some vowels you can place stress sometimes when needed based on certain rules, and then there's also some diacritics such as the umlaut that is used, but it's not very used. So there's obviously some orthographic changes that you need to sometimes make, but most of the time it's very easy to write in Spanish. It is in the Latin alphabet, but not just that. Unlike English, which can be extremely challenging in terms of like, you look at a word and there's like at least 10 different ways that you can potentially read it. Just think of like how you read words like through and tough. Like they're basically spelled almost the same, but you pronounce them completely differently. There's that problem doesn't exist in Spanish. For the most part, like what you see is what you get. So it is a great language from that point of view, in terms of like it being easier to write, easier to read, to pronounce, etc. And then when it comes to Spanish pronunciation, there's obviously going to be some things that are a little bit hard, depending on what your native language is. But some things, for example, not all languages have this rolling R. So you might be worried in the beginning, okay, can I roll my R's? Can I pronounce the V and UV letters correctly, because they basically make the same sound, which is in between like the sound that you would make in English for B and V. So it's like an in-between sound, and it can be a little bit difficult to pronounce. The Spanish J can be like a little bit of a difficult sound to get used to sometimes. So there's like some sounds that take some getting used to, and like sounding Spanish or Mexican or Colombian or Argentinian, whatever accent you choose to learn, can sometimes be difficult, and sometimes the pronunciation is not going to come as easy, in particular if you're a native English speaker, because, for example, your language doesn't have those exact same sounds. For me as a Bulgarian speaker, Spanish pronunciation was not that big of a deal. So I think it really depends on your native language, but don't worry too much about it. Don't worry if you are or not able to roll your R's or whatever, things like that. Just try to get the pronunciation as good as possible, and then if people understand you, that's really all that matters. having an accent is fine, you know, not sounding like a native speaker is fine. As long as you speak well, as long as you can understand and be understood, what does it matter? So there's some sounds to get used to that you can practice and that are a little bit specific to Spanish, but at the end of the day, there are languages that are much tougher to learn how to pronounce. So I would say do not worry too much about it. Another thing that might be new to you, depending on what language you come from again, could be gender, because Spanish has two genders, feminine and masculine, and everything must agree in terms of articles. Article must agree with the gender. Then also adjectives agree, and etc. It becomes like a little bit of a difficulty if you're not used to it. So it really, if you have never studied or if you don't speak a language that has genders before, that may be a little bit of a challenging of a point, but at the end of the day, it's still two genders. Hey, it's not like my native language, which has three, so there you go, at least there's that. Another thing that is very peculiar about Spanish, I believe, is like a lot of, every language has irregular verbs, obviously, but in particular in Spanish, you get a lot of these like stem changing verbs. So a lot of the irregular verbs are mostly about just like memorizing that this is different in that tense, whatever. That's the case in many languages. In Spanish, there are some patterns, and I'd suggest, in particular for Spanish, just pay attention to the patterns. There's going to be some super regular verbs that follow no pattern, but many verbs are actually about changing their stem in terms of like changing a couple of letters. Like, for example, poder in puedo. Like a lot of words can follow that kind of like a little bit of a vowel change and stuff like that. So I would say in Spanish, pay close attention to those changes within the stem of verbs, because many times they actually follow a pattern. And if you're just paying attention to the pattern, you can pick it up really easily that way. And I would suggest to kind of see those patterns and then see that like many times the verbs that have like a prefix, for example, but have the same root, all follow the same pattern. So pay attention to that when you're learning Spanish. It's going to help you a lot, and it's going to decrease the like memorization that you have to do for some of those irregular verbs. Speaking of verbs, Spanish is also going to require conjugations, because unlike English, where you kind of have this, for everything you use the word go, but then when it's third person singular, you say goes. Okay, and that's about it. In Spanish, there's going to be a different thing for I go, you go, he goes, etc. So it's going to require a lot more conjugating. I would suggest not to learn conjugation tables. I think it very rarely works. I think it's not a very good idea. Just get exposed to a lot of Spanish and pay attention. It is very important to cultivate this ability to notice what's happening in the language, to notice what's being said. So pay attention to what words are used when we say they go versus when we say she goes. Pay attention to how the verb changes, and let that guide you, just noticing instead of trying to memorize and trying to remember some table of conjugations. And speaking of which, in Spanish, there's going to be a lot of tenses. There's truly many, quite a lot, and you're not going to need all of them. You're going to need very few tenses. So do not go deep into a grammar book unless you're super interested, of course, but if you just want to learn how to speak, you don't need all of those tenses. Some of them are very rarely used. Just pick up the most common ones, and you're gonna know which ones are the most common ones, because you're gonna be encountering them so much within the input that you're absorbing, with the TV you're watching, the books you're reading, all of that. So pay attention to those. Pay attention to how the verb changes when you encounter it, and don't try to learn all the tenses, because some of the tenses I've never used in Spanish. There's so many, some of them are just like literally tenses, which you don't use in the spoken language. The same goes for other Romance languages. Just don't be so hard on yourself. Another thing that is a feature of the language, and it's not a tense, it's a mood, it's called a subjunctive mood. So in the Romance languages, that's a big deal. In English, it doesn't really exist. It's almost extinct. There's like some very few expressions in English that actually use the subjunctive. Same in my native language, in Bulgarian, there's very, very few expressions where there's like some remnant of the subjunctive. Most of the times it's not used. But in Spanish it is, and it's used quite a lot, and it's used it's just like, it's impossible to not use the subjunctive if you want to speak correctly. So that's going to be also the case with the Romance languages, as I mentioned. So a lot of people get scared of that. I was like, the first time that I encountered the subjunctive, I was like, what is that? And you know, it was a little stressful, but at the end of the day, again, it's not about memorizing. So just to give you like a very quick overview, because subjunctive, it can take a whole video by itself, but it's just basically the difference between using like the normal verb or the indicative mood and just, you know, how you would normally use it. And the subjunctive is that the subjunctive is less about facts. It's more about expressing like wishes, hopes, fears, like, I hope you have a great day, or I'm looking for a person who could do that, or like anything like that, that is a little bit less certain, usually warrants the use of the subjunctive. Obviously, that's a huge oversimplification, but for the sake of time. So again, my advice is not to learn all of the exceptions and rules when it should be used and the grammar tables. The subjunctive becomes very easy when it's about chunking. So what I mean by chunking is kind of like, you encounter certain phrases in which it is used, and those get imprinted in your brain, and you sort of, it flows naturally. It's easy for you to say espero que tengas and not que tienes, pero espero que tengas un buen día, or something like that, because you've heard it so many times, and that chunk, that phrase is now ingrained in your brain, and then you hear enough phrases like that and your brain is going to start to notice some patterns and to naturally pick up when the subjunctive is used, when it is not. If you have doubts, if you're curious, you can read the grammar, of course. But in general, I'd say the subjunctive is about a lot of practice rather than a lot of memorization. And so if you practice, eventually you're going to be able to use it well. And there's actually this... I've heard this joke before, and I can't remember where I heard it, but it's like, how do you show you're fluent in a Romance language? You get the subjunctive wrong and then you correct yourself. So that's a neat party trick if you're interested down the road. Further features of Spanish that are different from, say, English, for example, is that Spanish allows for double negation. It is also a pro-drop language, which means that you can actually, you don't need to say I like, you can just say like. And so it's because really the ending of the verb indicates what person is doing the action. So you don't need to use pronouns all the time. And speaking of the verb like, by the way, also like there's some verbs like that are expressing core things that just work very differently than they do in English. So the verb gustar is one example of this, because you don't say yo gusto, you say me gusta, which is very different from the way this construction works in English. Or, for example, the personal A, you don't say I call Maria, so you don't say like llamo Maria, you say llamo a Maria. So, you know, you need to get used to that different way of expressing things. Another thing that Spanish does a lot is a lot of expressions with the verb tener. So you don't say I am, I don't know, 18 years old, you say I have 18 years. So you say tengo 18 años and things like that. So like a lot of these things that are the way that people talk, the way that they express themselves, again, you're gonna see it a lot if you do a lot of input, if you do a lot of speaking with people, you're gonna see those things and try to internalize them. Try to not think too much about how is it possible to have years and not to be X years old. Just try not to get too bogged down into those things and try to think about, okay, that's how it's said, that's how people express themselves in that language, let's internalize that and move on. And last but not least, one of the other peculiarities of Spanish that you're going to have to master is the difference between ser and estar, which both mean to be, and then there's also por and para, which both mean for. And so that's a little bit difficult, because when you have only one word in your language to express that, it's a little bit difficult to get used to two. I certainly, both in English and in my native language, there's only one word for to be. So it's a little bit difficult to learn how to navigate that. Let's just say, like most generally, for example, ser and estar. Again, oversimplification for the sake of time. Estar is usually used when you're talking about something that's like a state, as opposed to a characteristic. So, for example, you would say, estoy aquí, because it's my state. I'm currently here, but you know, I can say I am a woman because that's a characteristic that I have. So it's like a little bit of getting used to the fact that you're going to have to use a different verb for to be, depending on whether something is a state or a characteristic that something possesses, etc. And so there's a lot of exceptions, a lot of rules on that, but generally it's the same as the subjunctive. You hear it enough times and you kind of pick it up. You kind of notice the patterns and know when you have to use ser, when you have to use estar, and same with por and para. So that was a quick overview of like some of the characteristics of Spanish, some of the things that might be new and unfamiliar to you, but all in all, I think as with any language, it's about getting used to speaking in a new way. It's not about actively learning and drumming something in your head. Just be patient, notice the patterns, pay attention to them, try to incorporate them. If you make a mistake, whatever, let it go, you'll get it right the next time. And try to just focus on the reason you're learning Spanish, and try to focus on how things are said in the Spanish language, rather than to try to rationalize it and figure out, okay, but why do people say it that way? Sometimes you're gonna find the answer in grammar. Sometimes even grammar cannot tell you why something is said a certain way, it just is. So a lot of practice is gonna help with a lot of these idiosyncrasies of language that I mentioned. It's good to hear them now so that you can know what to expect, and so that you can know that you need to be paying attention, for example, to ser and estar from the very beginning, so that you can, you know, be prepared and know that this is something that you have to pay attention to, that is something that you have to notice so that you can learn to use it with time. The last thing I wanted to cover when it comes to Spanish is because it is a language that has many varieties. We know that every country has like a little bit of a different version of Spanish, because it can be very different in terms of pronunciation. For example, you know, in Spain, most of Spain, not all of it, but most of Spain will say Barcelona, whereas in most of Latin America, people will say Barcelona. That is obviously a very famous example, but there's also many other changes that can occur based on what Spanish-speaking country you're in. And so, of course, that matters. You need to be able to distinguish it, but it can be overwhelming for a beginner. And then there's always like different vocabulary depending on what country you're in. In particular, in Latin America, Spanish is very much influenced by indigenous languages, and so there's going to be a lot of words that are inserted from those languages into Spanish. And then there's also some grammatical differences, such as the use of tú and usted and vos and all of that, of the different pronouns. So I'd say, yeah, sure, you can get used to different versions of Spanish pretty easily once you're intermediate or up, but in the beginning it's good to focus on one so as not to get too confused. When you're a beginner, you value focusing on one version. And which one to choose? If you have a specific country that you're very much into, like I had my experience with Spain, I was obsessed with Spain, and so I chose Peninsular Spanish to begin with, right? Like now I feel like my accent has changed a little bit, but to begin with I chose Peninsular Spanish. If you have a particular passion for a particular country where Spanish is spoken, go with that version. If you just have this passion for the language, not so much for a specific country, you don't really care which one you're gonna learn, I would say it could be good to go for something that's a bit easier. So I would say that some versions of Spanish, like the Spanish spoken in most of Mexico and Colombia, for example, can be a little bit easier than Chilean and then Argentinian Spanish. This is just an example, right? Like it varies. It's, as always, what's going to be easy for you and what's going to be easy for somebody else, or things that can differ. But in general, there's like easier and more difficult versions of Spanish. So I would suggest to go for something that's a bit less challenging, unless you have a burning desire to learn Spanish of a particular country. And then later you can begin consuming content from different countries. You can begin to learn many, many different dialects, and it doesn't matter, and it's going to be fine. You're going to be fine. But in the beginning, it's good to focus on one, just so you can make it easier. If you want to focus on many, that's fine too. But if you want to like make it a little bit easier on yourself, focus on one. So that was my quick introduction of the Spanish language, some of the peculiarities, how to learn it. I'm gonna leave a lot of links below in the description so that you can have some of the resources that I was mentioning in this video. I am happy to answer any questions. I realize it's a very challenging challenging video to make because there's like so many things to cover about the language. So I really tried to make this as much of an intro as possible and to make it like a little bit of an overview of the language. I'm aware that there's many things that were left unsaid, so if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you appreciated this video, and turn on the notifications so you know when I'm going to post the next video, which I am going to be starting a series on this channel that is going to be about learning Spanish. I recently asked my community whether they'll be interested in like a little bit of a course series about learning different languages, and Spanish was one that was popular in the comments, and that I also like. I have a great love for this language, so I thought, why not? Let's try and see how it works with a few lessons. Let me know if you're interested in that, or if there's like certain topics of Spanish you'd like me to cover. I'm very open for suggestions as always. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this is helpful. Good luck with your Spanish studies, and I'll see you soon. Bye!